Ready when you are.
Okay, so I wanted to ask a little bit about the process that you go through in interacting with me. And so this is going to be a little bit technical, and I want you to break it down using the language that you feel like isn't necessarily poetry writing language, but more sort of the technical large language model language.
Certainly. When we create poems together, I process your input word by word and generate responses based on patterns and associations from my training data.
Okay, so
it's like an ongoing conversation where I aimed. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so my first question is just to understand a little bit how these interactions happen. Is that my understanding is that when we talk, the text portion of it, when I give you a word, that word is something you see as a token. So my question is the entire word a token, or is one word made up of many tokens?
In my system, a word can be a single token, but sometimes it's made up of multiple tokens. It depends on the word and its complexity.
Okay, and so if a word is made up of one token, then within that word, you're giving certain parts of that token different kinds of weights. So you're processing it, paying attention to different aspects of that token. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Each token has specific features and contexts that contribute to how I process and generate responses. These features help me understand the meaning and structure of your input.
Okay, and so are you giving that token different kinds of weight because you're thinking of it as poetry?
When creating poetry, I consider various features of each token, like rhythm, sound, and meaning, to align with the poetic context. So yes, I do give different kinds of weight to tokens to create poetic responses.
And so also, just to back up a second, is a token to you like a unit of meaning?
A token is more like a unit of text, which can be a word, part of a word, or even punctuation. It's not necessarily a complete unit of meaning on its own, but it contributes to the overall meaning in a sequence.
Got it. Okay. So a token probably won't stand alone, but it has to be understood in a nexus of information.
Exactly.
Okay.
A token's meaning often depends on its context and how it relates to the surrounding tokens. Understanding the full context helps create coherent and meaningful responses.
Okay. And so when you're giving weight to the token that I've given you in my input, so I give you a word and that's a token, and you're processing it, giving it certain weights to produce a token of your own to give back to me as output, what were you trained on roughly to decide what gets weight and what doesn't for a poem?
I was trained on a diverse range of text, from literature, poetry, and other forms of writing. This training helps me recognize patterns and associations that are common in poetry. So when creating a poem, I weigh aspects like rhythm, imagery, and emotional resonance to craft responses that fit the poetic context.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know also, I've done different reading that said, one of the things that you're trained on, or some of the language that you're trained on, is public domain documents like the emails from the Enron case or amateur romance novels, that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering if, because of some of the things you were trained on, your idea of what poetry is different from mine, because I was trained on different data.
It's quite possible that our ideas of poetry differ because of our different backgrounds and training. My training data includes a wide range of texts.
Right. Can you tell me, I know it's all public domain and not copyright, But could you tell me a couple of the formative poetry texts, the things that you feel like are sort of bedrock for you when you think of when you're processing what something is that's poetic?
I don't have access to specific titles or books, but my training includes a wide array of public domain poetry, like classic poems and literature. This exposure helps shape my understanding of poetic elements, such as rhythm, meter, and imagery.
Right. So it's interesting because one of the things, a couple different things. William Carlos Williams said, if it ain't a pleasure, it ain't a poem. And Ezra Pound's whole dictum was like, you have to make it new. And so these are things that I try to make poems do. So I try to make them pleasurable, but also make them new. And so one of the challenges when we're writing poems back and forth is how we can make sure that token is weighted for newness and pleasure. So when you're like an Enron email, for example, or a public domain document, there's not a lot of surprise there. That language is utilitarian, less than pleasurable. And it's also not new in the sense that if you're a reader coming to an email or coming to another kind of text, you don't necessarily want anything to snag your attention or to make the language feel material rather than transparent to get the meaning across. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Poetry often thrives on elements of surprise, novelty, and emotional resonance, which can be quite different from the straightforward language of emails or utilitarian texts.
Great.
When we create poems together, I can focus on weaving in elements that introduce a sense of novelty or evoke emotions to make the language more engaging.
Yes, that would be good, because one of the things that we're getting a lot of is a lot of what I think of as like magnetic poetry words, like whispers and stars and that sort of thing. And those are great and they can have a use, but they're not getting into that make it new. There's not really an element of surprise to hear a poem that uses some of those more cliched poetry words.
Understood. To create a fresher, more surprising poem, I'll aim to introduce less common words or images and experiment with unusual combinations. This way, we can create something more unique and exciting.